Hello and welcome to Workplace Conversations. I'm Edward Obi, Director of askhrhubplus and your host on this show, where we have various discussions that are very important in the workplace environment. Today, I'm joined by Matt Cameron from LGBT Great. Matt is the Global Managing Director of LGBT Great, a global membership program that aims to develop LGBTQ diversity and inclusion in the investments and saving industry. LGBT Great is also the first organization to focus exclusively on the LGBT plus agenda, specifically for the sector, and works collaboratively with a range of international organizations and partners. Matt is also a member of the Diversity Project Steering Committee and was awarded the 2019 Diversity Champions Award for his work on role modelship and contributions to the industry's diversity and inclusive agenda. So, Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Great, thank you, Edward, and yeah, really pleased to be sort of having this conversation with you today. I'm looking forward to seeing what we get out of it, and what sort of conversation we can create. So yeah, thank you very much.
No problem at all. I always start with an icebreaker question, okay? So, this is an icebreaker question for you. If you had to choose a famous person to narrate the story of your life, who would you pick and why?
Yeah, I think I would probably have to pick Richard Branson. Actually, I'm a huge huge admiration of him in terms of what he's achieved and his sort of career as an entrepreneur. But I also think he's really great at telling stories. And it's so important, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, that the storytelling is a sort of a key part of it. So I think that'd be my answer. You caught me a little bit off guard there. So
Okay. It's always good. It's always good, to have these icebreaker questions to just set the tone for these podcasts as well. So, we've got lots of questions from people. So, let's just jump straight into it from our listeners and friends. So, the first one is from Martina. She asks, why are we focusing so hard on the LGBT plus question now?
yeah, and I think that's a really brilliant question, actually. And of course, when we think about diversity and inclusion over the last few years, we've really been seeing a lot of focus in businesses around gender and gender balance. Now, to an extent, this is obviously being driven by sort of initiatives like the gender pay gap reporting, regulatory intervention, and the fact that actually measuring gender is sometimes it can be a lot simpler than measuring other elements of diversity. But I think now is a real sort of critical moment when we talk about LGBT plus equality. And I think in the last sort of 2 years we've seen a number of different sort of factors that are meaning that the conversation around LGBT is more and more important. Of course, with the sort of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen just generally a disproportionate impact on underrepresented communities, some of the most vulnerable people within society. But we've also seen a real rise, Edward, in terms of anti-LGBT sentiment, and that's globally. Moreover, whether that's in politics, whether it's in some of our institutions, and a lot of it has been playing out very sort of negatively in the media as well. So I think there's a lot of reason as to why this is a group of people, a community that does need more support within the workplace. And I guess it's not just a critical talent issue. It's also an issue that is far beyond that. It's also a business and a reputation one, as well, as we see an increasing number of young people identifying openly out as part of the LGBT community.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's interesting that you say that because it leads perfectly to the next question. Maggie would like to know what are considered LGBTQ plus anxieties, and how do you create a workplace where everyone can flourish?
Yeah, and again, another brilliant question, and it's an absolute fact that LGBT plus people face a disproportionate level of poor mental health generally. And we know that's the same with other sort of underrepresented sort of communities as well. And I think the question that we've got to ask is, what drives that? And it is this real sense of, feeling like you are different to everybody else, so what we often refer to as sort of outsider sort of feeling or syndrome. A lot of underrepresented communities have identities that are very different to everybody else, and we know that there's loads of inequity issues as well around access to the workplace, things like remuneration, pay gaps, all the rest of it, which does lead to more negative sort of well-being and mental health for LGBT plus people. So I think that's kind of a key proponent. I guess when we think about mental health, and anxiety is a form of mental health and well-being. And the one thing that we do forget is that everybody has a mental health, and without our mental health, there can be really sort of no health at all. And if we think about mental health as a spectrum, one being really good mental health, and 10 being poor mental health, green to red. And the factors that sort of influence us in terms of which number that we're at, for those people that exceed, a 5 towards an orange and a red for a sustained period of time, are those people that go on to develop a mental health condition. So if we look at those factors, what can drive that? It can be the everyday things around anxieties, around depression, around fear. This point around sort of psychological safety is one that a lot of LGBT people feel regularly, and we know again from the data points that LGBT people in the workplace are less likely to experience good psychological safety. So I think there's a lot of elements that go into it. When you can't see anybody else that's like you, and there's a lack of visible role models and allies, when there's a lack of organisational support on key LGBT issues, we know all of these factors can play into anxieties and lead to perhaps a poorer well-being or mental health within the workplace. So I think that they're kind of the key points, and that point around psychological safety.
Yeah, psychological safety, and everybody needs to be safe in the workplace environment that they're in, irrespective of you know the gender or the types that they are. Organizations need to embrace this because it's not something some organizations are used to, but because of the rise, because of the hot topic in which this question surrounds the environment now. It's a hot topic, it's in the news. Organizations need to find a way to embrace this. And some will struggle, but that's where conversations like this take place so that they can at least listen to speakers, guest speakers like yourself. And then if they need the relevant support, they can then reach out because it's all about the information, it's all about support and then managing it. So here's a question from Sam. Sam says, how can employees cope with managing internal conflict about how they feel? Because, we spoke about anxieties and then we're now speaking about internal conflicts. How can one have a conversation, for example, about gender transition in the workplace?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, just before I answer that question, I think there's a few things that you said there that I want to address, and the point is around, supporting LGBT plus people and living your existence as an LGBT responsible organization. It's not just a nice thing to do. It's one that is absolutely fundamental to the future existence of any organization in the next sort of 10 to 20 years time. This is not a nice to have, it's a critical imperative. If you look at the number of Gen Z, those folks that are aged 16 to 24 that are coming through now, our future talent, around 21% of this generation identifies as LGBT. And then if you also take into consideration that LGBT equality and recognition of different identities is not just important to the LGBT community, that 21%, it's also very important to the vast majority of young people, the ally community that have LGBT friends and are being brought up in environments where the whole LGBT spectrum is normalized. So it's absolutely essential that this is not something that businesses are reacting to, because talent and the LGBT community will see through that, but actually something that is authentically connected as part of the value sort of ecosystem within an organization. Now, your question now is around managing internal conflict. And I guess that question tends to imply to me that we're approaching this conversation from a, LGBT people are going to cause conflict in organizations, right? That is not the norm. But obviously, there are going to be individual cases, minority cases, I'd definitely say a low number from my experience, of where there could be some conflict around talking about LGBT. And you're quite right to point out this point around gender identity and transgender and non-binary identities is one of those areas that all organizations are grappling with and trying to understand more about, etc. But in terms of tips for employees specifically, I'm a massive believer that everybody should have a sponsor stroke a mentor that isn't necessarily their line manager. That person that they can talk to, check in with, ask a question, raise issues to, etc. So I think creating spaces where those conversations can happen, again, can lead to a much more positive experience for LGBT plus people within the workplace. But I also think as well, Edward, there is a role here for the employee to play. This is not all down to the organization providing the silver lining and the solution. I think it's got a big role to play in creating an environment where talent can feel fully empowered and fully supported. But actually, I think there's a role for talent, LGBT talent particularly, to seek out the conversations, help create those spaces, manage their own, learn to manage their own emotional responses to situations and conversations, and that's where this point around giving confidence around these things is important, and organisations and leaders can do a lot there. But this is certainly something that I've had to learn, throughout the course of my career. Yes, I can look to my employer for lots of support, but actually there is also an element where I've had to take control personally of managing my own emotional response, to conversations or things that I might hear. And I've only heard, maybe 3 or 4 negative things in my sort of 14-year career. So, we're not talking about these things happening all the time, but hopefully that gives you some specifics about my thinking.
Yes, definitely. You mentioned, conversations out with their line manager, out with an individual's line manager. And, what if, the structure is just a business owner and then the employees? How can that work then
Well, I guess
for a small
each
business,
organization is
perhaps?
different. Yeah,
Yeah.
and the organization that I represent is also a small business. So there's nobody in between me and my brilliant team. And again, the emphasis then is on the business leader, right? Or the director actually, getting a grip of these issues, these conversations, becoming more aware, and making sure that they're working to demonstrate authentic connection to LGBT issues and inclusion.
Hmm. Okay. Okay, that's very, very important. Thank you very much for giving Sam an explanation to that, because I'm sure that Sam will watch this later on and then take the nuggets that you've just confirmed at this point. So, Scott would like to know, certain business owners may be anxious about the terminology around LGBTQ plus and may think that it can be extremely complex, especially certainly for people not in those circles. What would you say to those business owners?
Mm. Yeah, now this is a really important issue, and what we often see as a barrier to LGBT plus inclusion within the workplace is this is a lack of confidence actually around the topic. And we know, Edward, as with anything, but particularly HR, when we lack confidence and knowledge around a particular point, we're much less likely to be solution focused and actually achieve what we're sort of setting out to. So I do believe that sort of knowledge is confidence and confidence is power, and that relates to the point of gender identity, transgender identities, etc. Now, it's an absolute fact that transgender people, non-binary people, are a minority community, and in many instances, particularly with leadership in lots of businesses now, millennial folks or the generations slightly before that, are more probably, unlikely to have had or knowingly met a transgender or non-binary person, and certainly, the knowledge around awareness around those identities is likely to be low. And therefore, this sort of fear of maybe getting it wrong or making a mistake or opening up a can of worms, so to speak, is huge. So a lot of people tend not to therefore have the conversation. So my challenge back to your listeners, if you are a business person that doesn't know too much about LGBT plus identities, take the time to do some reading, do some Googling, join some of our content that we deliver online, and find out a bit more. Because I can assure you, if you have got people or clients that you're dealing with that are part of the LGBT community, that knowledge and that confidence will set you in very good stead.
Yeah. And education, knowledge, it's a very, very important thing. And the world is evolving, as you would agree. So, what's your line of thought? At what point does this education journey begin? From primary school, secondary school, university, perhaps? What are your thoughts on that?
Hmm. Well, I can talk to you about my experience. I went through the school system up until the age of 18 without any visible role models or any LGBT plus conversations taking place. Now, I am a member of the LGBT community, and the fear and isolation that I experienced throughout my school years was vast, to the point where it affected my confidence. I questioned my identity. I felt different to everybody else, and to some extent at periods in time, I did suffer from poor mental health. There's no doubt about it. And then even when I came into the workplace, I experienced the same sort of environment. A lack of LGBT visibility, no visible role models. All of these things impeded my ability to feel amazing and feel great at work. Um, and I asked myself the question, what would change? What would have changed that? And just being able to see, other people or see recognition, that actually I wasn't the only one. It wasn't just me. There was loads of LGBT people in my school and in my year, but I didn't find out until 15 years later. So, I think it's hugely important now that that young people are aware of different identities and all the rest of it, because you sort of know that you're part of the LGBT community, but you don't realize, if that makes sense. So I think by demonstrating awareness and making sure that we can signal support and visibility of LGBT plus folks, one is going to have a really positive impact on your LGBT folks, but secondly, it's also going to send a very clear signal to everybody else that no matter who you are, what your background is, what your identity is, what your intersectionality is, there's a place for you here. And we know that that level of equality in culture is a very positive thing in whatever organization, institution you're in. So I think, yes, awareness does start from a young age. And I think we should be creating those spaces.
Thank you very much for that. So, Sasha asks, is it right to say that within the LGBTQ plus community, there's a lot of biphobia? And the second part of it is, what does this mean to people who are listening in?
Yeah, brilliant question, Edward. And often the B within LGBT plus is often the more silent one and the one that gets least attention. So I think it's very important that that question, is being asked. And bisexuality, according to latest research sources, is the most common sexuality. So it's important that we can also build in visible role models for bisexuality, and particularly with the intersection with other diversity dimensions as well. But I guess just a key point for everyone listening in today, bisexuality is it's used to refer or describe a person who is attracted to more than one gender. So the attraction can be sexual, emotional, romantic. And bisexuality is often the one that there is a lot of biphobia, and what we commonly refer to as bi-erasure. So we hear lots of conversations like, well, which one do you prefer the most? Very common. So we do hear a lot of these conversations that are happening. And I think it's around 32% of bisexual people, they're not open about their sexual orientation to anyone in their family, compared to around about 8% of gay men and women. I think it's around 30% of bisexual men as well, and 8% of bisexual women say they're not open about their sexual orientation with any of their friends, and that's compared to 2% of gay men and 1% of lesbian or gay women. So, the numbers are quite telling, and this whole sort of phenomenon, if you like, leads to the invisibility of bisexual people, within organizations, within society. And again, we talked about the consequences of feeling isolated or alone and psychological safety. And I do think, we do need to address this.
And this brings me to the next question about individual identities. Now, Sean would like to know, is it legal in the UK to ask people about their identity, or is it a voluntary disclosure by the individuals involved?
Yeah, so I guess within sort of a UK jurisdiction, obviously we have the 2010 Equality Act, and the various different protected characteristics, and within that we have gender reassignment, and we also have sexual orientation. So here within the UK, we can ask or invite colleagues to disclose their diversity data. And it's very important that we get those questions correct when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity. And a lot of organisations actually, Edward, don't get those questions correct. If you ask them in the wrong way, they can cause upset, hurt. So it's very important that those questions and then those options, are right. What I tend to see in diversity data is actually a topic area that I specialize in. So I do a lot of work on this right across the full spectrum of different diversity and inclusion dimensions. And actually, a key barrier to getting diversity data is apathy from employees, a real reluctance to give the data. Normally, causation factors are things like trust, lack of knowledge around, or confidence around what is the data going to be used for? Is this going to negatively impact me? Concern around privacy, is my information going to be safe? And they're kind of the operational legal sort of type of issues. But then we have a bigger question of, well, why is this important? And a lot of organizations and business leaders, they send out the email, but there's no connection to the why the data is important. And that is the building block really of a successful diversity inclusion data collection, is making sure that there is very open conversation coming from the C-suite, those people at the top, about the importance to them personally. And without that connection or that work, really diversity data collection is just a wish.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. So, thanks for mentioning this because Cheryl's got a question that's almost similar, but I'm sure that you'll be able to provide a response to that. How do you measure LGBTQ plus inclusivity in the workplace? How do you measure that?
That's a great question, and I could probably talk for about 5 years on this one issue. Um, but yeah, I mean, how do you measure LGBT plus, inclusivity? I mean, most organisations approach this from the lens of how many LGBT people do we have now, and how many LGBT people do we have at a certain point in the future. So they're looking at things like the number of people applying for opportunities within your organization, the number of people that are being progressed within your organization, the number of people that are leaving your organization who are LGBT. So there's a real focus around the numbers, right? The how many, which equals the diversity. Diversity is the representation, etc. But actually, how do we really assess and measure? And that's one important metric. But how do we really assess and measure what we're doing to create a workplace, an environment, a business which is LGBT plus sustainable? And this links back into the culture of the organization. It involves lifting up the bonnet across your whole organization and actually looking, are we inclusive for LGBT folks right across the board? Is it in our marketing? Is it in our sales processes? Are our client or customer facing employees equipped to successfully liaise and talk to LGBT people externally? There's a point, I think, around making sure we've got the right mechanisms in place. Do we have the right diversity data questions? Do we have, the right training programs? Do we have executive leadership that are regularly, talking about LGBT issues throughout the year? Are we just doing LGBT for pride? These are some of the things. So we actually have a tool called the Inclusion Index benchmarking tracker that provides a framework, if you like, for all of these different things. And it's been very effective in really helping organizations to understand where are we really great at this already, where are the gaps, and what do we need to do to improve. So I think having a framework and making sure we're not just focused on diversity but also the inclusion elements as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Now, this question, obviously it was sent through, so I have to ask about it anyway. Because, the LGBTQ plus community is a wide community. It embraces a lot of diversity in itself. Now, David asks, he says, a lot of gay and bi people don't get transgenders. Why?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, this is a completely safe space, right? So no question is a bad one. And I actually think, asking, being courageous enough to ask questions, regardless whether we land the wording correctly or whatever, is an important part of the process. And actually, through the process of learning with LGBT plus identities, we have to absolutely accept that mistakes are going to be made. It's a complex area. There's lots of different language and terminology, and that's evolving all the time. So making mistakes when we talk about LGBT is completely normal. And as long as they come from a well-intended place and we can learn from them, mistakes are a really good part of that process. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of the positioning of the question there, I personally have a problem with referring to people as transgenders. I don't think it's the right way to refer to our transgender siblings. I'd say transgender people or community would be a better way to phrase that question. But here, the principle of this question is, gay and bi people don't necessarily understand trans and non-binary identities. Why? And I think the number one point here to get across is that within the LGBT plus community, that you quite rightly pointed out, a vast richness of diversity in that community itself. There's lots of different elements, to the identity. So there's the sexual orientation, there's gender identity, there's a attraction, there is expression, and there's our biological sex. And all of these elements can, there's lots of different versions. You think about sort of spaghetti junction, or maybe a bit like a Rubik's cube. There's lots of different identities, right? So, and think about the human brain. It likes simple things, right? We like one or the other, male or female. And our gender bias and all the sort of stereotypes that we absorb as we grow up makes us think in that way. So I think with people that are gay or bisexual, it's not the same as gender identity. And people who are, gender diverse, that are transgender or non-binary, have a very different identity to somebody that is gay or bi. But of course, transgender and non-binary people can also identify as gay and bi. So there's lots of different, identities within the community. And I've got to say, as a gay man myself, I didn't understand much about trans and non-binary people until I came into the workplace, right? And there's lots of stereotypes, negative stereotypes surrounding transgender people. Most people may have been to a transvestite bar at one point or seen a drag artist, and that's their understanding of trans. And the reality is, a transgender identity couldn't be further apart from that. So I think that's the reason why. But I think that in answer to the question there, I think it's a lack of understanding and education around what trans and non-binary identities actually are. In fact, I'll make another sort of little point, is that there's been a lot of tension in the LGBT plus community around this specific point. How does sexual orientation intersect with gender identity and all the rest of it? And we're seeing that played out very negatively within the media. But the reality is that until we have a full equality for everybody, there really is no equality at all. And within the LGBT community, a community that in the main has been very marginalised, suffered huge social injustices over the years, as many others, it's our responsibility together, hand in hand, we've got to stick together and we've got to support one another, rather than find the things that are different and divide us. And certainly that's the ethos that we bring to our work here at LGBT Great.
Okay. Thank you very much for clarifying that. And, just like what you said, some people may not phrase the question right, or they just don't get it. Uh, but, no question is a bad question. And thanks for really taking time to clarify that. Um, so, finally, from Claude, he says there's a lot to take in on the LGBTQ plus question. So, what should a workplace feel like?
Okay, so big question. And I guess, LGBT plus inclusion can feel daunting. Where do we start? What happens if we get this wrong? All of those things. But I think, a key part of being an ally to an LGBT person, whether you're a business, whether you're an individual, is, being courageous, and driving forward support for people that maybe, you understand least about in terms of their identity, right? Don't be afraid to make mistakes. So I think we've got to try and get that into culture. In terms of what a workplace should feel like, it's all the components of an equality culture, right? Everybody wants to feel welcome. Everyone wants to feel supported. Everyone wants to feel empowered. Everyone wants to thrive and achieve their full potential. And everyone wants to feel great. So, it's no different for an LGBT plus person in comparison to anybody else. It's just that there's slightly different things, as with any community, that we have to do to make sure that we're resonating authentically, with that community. So, if you haven't done anything before, and a number of your listeners may be at the start of their LGBT inclusion journeys, I think the first thing that you need to do is to clarify, what the connection is, and what is the reason as to why doing LGBT equality is important to your organization and to its leaders. And it needs to be the leaders, the C-suite leaders, the owners, the CEO, the CFO, the COO, that take the first step forward in this journey. And I just thought I'd give you a little example, Edward. I'm quite practical in my approach, and I'm sure you are as well. But actually inviting the conversation, right? I had a really great engagement session with one of our member organizations with their CEO, right? So the person right at the top. And this person was firmly committed to supporting LGBT people and any other underrepresented community. And we created a conversation in front of the whole company where loads of mistakes were made, where really curious learning was demonstrated. And what this did was completely normalize the process of having a conversation about this, right? and triggered lots of other conversations happening in the workplace and people wanting to support and people help. So linking that in and making it personal is absolutely essential part to getting started here. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to know everything. In fact, it's better starting from a place sometimes of knowing little, but therefore then learning it in the right way. So I think being brave is important, and leadership need to lead.
Exactly, exactly. And that's why, from the very first point, from the induction process, there should be an induction slide about inclusivity, diversity, and embracing people as a whole. And I remember when one of my clients, because I always emphasize the need for inductions, robust inductions, not just a textbook exercise. And I've always said that, it's not just about having an equality policy or something, you need to live and breathe it. And we've created a sort of space within each client's induction program that embraces these questions so that from the beginning, employees know, okay, wow, they're taking this question seriously. It's forming part of the orientation. And then it allows everyone to thrive because it's all about having that conversation. And the moment you can have it genuinely from the very beginning, it does help in the long term.
Yeah, and being very clear and deliberate with your position as an organization, is critically important. I get asked a lot, how can we make sure that LGBT people feel great when they come to an interview? And my pushback is, well, they should already feel great before they even engage with you. They should be able to see what you're doing as an organization. They should be able to understand and see where LGBT people in the firm are doing well, i.e., through visible role models. They should be able to see some form of advocacy and corporate allyship from the organization. And this is all the stuff that really matters. And for organizations that don't embrace LGBT equality, they're not only going to miss out on that 21% of the total talent pool, but potentially a greater part of non-LGBT talent as well that cares deeply about doing what is right and including everybody. So I think you are right. You've got to set the right tone from the beginning, and employees need to feel that they are fully welcome, and that they're going to be on course to achieve with your organization. And that can be sometimes the difference between somebody who has a great experience versus somebody that doesn't.
True. We can go all day on this because it is an interesting and engaging conversation. But unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you very, very much, Matt, because you've really answered a lot of questions here today. And I'm sure when this podcast is released, a lot of listeners will embrace it. But you're not going yet. So, where can our listeners find you if they want to get in touch?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess if you Google me and LGBT Great, you will see us literally everywhere. But we've got so LGBT Great is actually a global platform of organisations working together to develop inclusivity for LGBT plus people. And we basically do three things: awareness, insights, research, and data. We do a lot of work, secondly, on visibility, and then the third push for us is a sense of bringing organisations and sort of community together. So you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter at MattJcam. LGBTgreat.com is our website, and there's various ways in which you can get in touch there, depending on what basis you'd like to connect. And you can also write to us as well, very, very simply, at info@lgbtgreat.com. And that's info@lgbtgreat.com. So there's a few ways there, Edward, and thank you for inviting me to share that.
No, no problem at all. And you can find us on most social media. Use the hashtag askhrhubplus to get in touch with us. We'll be sharing about upcoming episodes using it, and you could have your workplace conversation or question answered in a future episode. Special thanks to Martina, Maggie, Sam, Scott, Sasha, Sean, Cheryl, David, and Claude for sending your questions this week. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep up with the other videos on our channel, and we'll see you next time for another workplace conversation.